So our next speaker will be Larry Zitnick. Larry, today, I think he's going to talk about an important topic. Not really, it sounds like it's not about a specific project. It's like a general research, I would say, philosophy or research, the style of research. That is, what's the right question to ask, right? What's the right questions that have been asked historically in the community? And whether we're right now still asking the right question to push our understanding of vision and common sense knowledge. So I think, at least in the past 5-7 years, Larry's own research has been a lot of focusing on like visual C understanding and its connection to language, the role of common sense and semantics. I still remember when I was an undergrad, that was back in 2013, I saw Larry's, the first paper that, my understanding is the first paper in Larry's series of work on this topic. The first paper was on bringing semantics into focus using visual abstraction. That is using abstract scenes to understand the role of semantics and including objects, attributes, and their relations, like propositions. And later, this leads to a number of work on abstract scene understanding. It then leads to VQA, visual question answering, and the larger data set moving from synthetic to real, video captioning, image captioning. And later, back, I think that's 2017, well, there's a huge trend on people doing visual question answering. And Larry again asked, are we really understanding vision and language? Or are we just learning some correlations? And then there's the data set Clever trying to diagnose what's really happening with this visual reasoning model. So I think in some sense, right, Larry's past research in the past 5 or 7 years has been really thinking about what's the right question to ask on visual C understanding and common sense reasoning. So I'm glad that we're going to hear from Larry about this topic. So welcome, Larry. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. So as already mentioned, my talk that I'm going to give right now is going to be a little different from the talks that we've seen so far. I've really enjoyed a lot of the discussion that we've had so far and seeing the work that's been going on and learning about how kids learn and whether we have the same common sense as a spider. It's quite intriguing. But what I want to talk about today is what is the right question to ask? And what kind of inspired me to talk about this was the title of the workshop was a question itself, which is how far are we from the common sense of a toddler? I thought that was a really interesting question, and I figured, why don't we try to answer that question a little bit today and look at some historical perspective on this to get a better understanding of where we are in the field today. But before we go there, let's talk about two different types of questions. One is inspirational questions versus actionable questions. So I look at an inspirational question is one that if you went to a graduate student and you said, here's a question, you ask them what the answer was, they'd go, that's interesting. That's an interesting question. But they might not know where to start. They might not know how to start doing research on that problem. Versus one that's actionable is one where they're like, oh, yeah, I get it. That's a really interesting question. I think I might have a solution to it. So that's an actionable question. So if we go to the question, which kind of is at the heart of what we're talking about today, what the workshop's been discussing today, which is how do we teach machines the common sense of a toddler? When we think about, what does a toddler know? If you look at these two toddlers here, I mean, like the amount of information, we've already heard this today as well. I mean, the amount of knowledge they have is pretty extraordinary. The grasp of language that they have, they know how to manipulate objects, they know how to reason. They still seem like kids, obviously, but they're incredibly intelligent. So when you think about this and you say, okay, how am I going to teach a machine the common sense of a toddler? You pause, you think. So this question really is one that is more inspirational right now at this point than actionable. So one question that I was thinking about is how do we take this question and transform it from inspirational to actionable? And one way to do this, or one way to think about this problem is instead of, looking at this problem itself, but let's go back in history. Let's look back at computer vision and let's look at another problem that went from inspirational to actionable and how we got there. And maybe that'll be informative about this question, about common sense, about where we are right now, and then maybe how we can push ourselves forward to make that question no longer inspirational, but make it actionable. So let's talk about object recognition. So if we go back to 1966, you have Marvin Minsky. He, it's, a folklore at this point where he went up to a graduate student and said, to the graduate student, connect a television camera to a computer and get the machine to describe what it sees. And if you look at the question, which is related to this, it's basically asking, how can we get machines to recognize objects familiar to humans? Now, in 1966, was this an actionable question or was this inspirational? And I would make the case that in 1966, this was an inspirational question. However, today, in 2020, this is much more of an actionable question. So how did this question go from inspirational to actionable? So if we look at now, what we're going to do is we're going to step through history. And we're going to look at the questions that different people asked to get us to the point where we are right now. So one of the earliest questions that people asked when they started thinking about pattern recognition was, how do we recognize simple patterns? So in 68, there's this really fun paper here, which if you look at the two C's on the left, they differ from each other more than the C and the O on the right. Yet the C and the O have less X's changed between the two, the C in the middle at least, and the O on the right have less X's changed between the two than the two C's on the left. And this is something that people in the early days of pattern recognition just found really fascinating. They're like, wow, what do we use as a distance metric? How do you even do character recognition when you have properties such as this one? And then if you're, back in the 70s, before you even think about how to, recognize like an image or recognize something in an image, you had to solve much more simple and even mundane questions, which were like, how do you actually capture a digital image? And then after you capture a digital image, how do you recognize faces? And if anybody knows Takeo Kanade, this is what he did for his thesis. And this is really a nice quote from his work here, which is, it might be considered that recognition of faces and other natural scenes would only be a little more complex than characters, which is what people were mostly focusing on before because it's so hard to digitize images. But actually, completely new aspects appear. And if you read his thesis, literally half of the thesis is just on how to capture the digital image, how to actually get the data to then train the face recognition. Now, in 1973, there were other people working on face recognition as well. You had, the famous constellation model, where you had, like all the eyes and nose and things are all attached by springs. And this was a great kind of conceptual idea that kept popping up over and over in computer vision for the next 40, 50 years about how to recognize objects. And if you look at the data they trained on, this is the type of data that they were using. It worked really well. If I remember correctly, it was like 16 out of 19 examples that got correct, or something along that order of magnitude. And it even worked really well when they added noise to the data. And it's really interesting to see, these are the actual images that they had in the paper, and this is how they had to display the images. And when they wanted to talk about where the eyes were located, they actually had to give coordinates because there's no way to actually draw, no way to actually generate good figures back then. There's no PowerPoint or anything. If we fast forward, there's the AI winner, things kind of went down. We had the 1980s. People kind of went back to basics. They had a hard time kind of going beyond just faces or going beyond digits. So they started looking at edges and corners. And this is when, the Harris corner detector came about and the canny edge detector became famous. And then, we went back to digits. So, how do we recognize digits? And the famous, CNN. It actually was the first time that we could reliably detect digits. 90s, there's a bunch of stuff that went in there, but we'll skip over a lot of the 90s because we can't take forever on this. But basically, when we went to 2001, we finally could recognize faces. Did we already ask this question? Yeah, we already asked this question, 30 years before, but finally we were in the right place to ask this question properly, which was we finally had enough face data. We finally had computers that were fast enough, and we could actually do rapid and reliable face detection. And Viola Jones is the most famous example of this. And it's an algorithm similar to this is what was in digital cameras up until to this point, probably today, because it's just so efficient. Then with this new kind of with the new successes that we had in the early 2000s with face recognition, with instance recognition, etc., the field began to get a little bit more daring, and we even asked, could we recognize categories? And for those of you familiar with the object class recognition by unsupervised scale invariant learning, this is basically a revisit of the constellation model from 1973 with faces, but applying it to object categories. Now, this worked pretty well, and for the first time, these results today might not look as impressive, But at the time, it was really amazing because up to this point, the only thing we could recognize were digits, faces, and we could recognize the Notre Dame. You know, we could do instance recognition really well. But these motorcycles look really different from each other, and it was able to recognize it. So it was a pretty, you know, this was an impressive work at the time. Now, if you go back and you say, okay, so why did this actually work? A lot of it was because of the data set. It was a fairly simple data set. You know, you have all the bicycles are all faced, and motorcycles, they're all facing the same direction. You have the planes, all facing the same direction. The faces were actually all shot by the same student with the same camera. So even the flash going off was consistent with almost every single one. The cars, again, you know, they're all rear cars taken on the same day. So the data set was fairly simple, but at the time it was impressive. Now, with that, then it came to the question of, okay, can we recognize other objects? Can we recognize pedestrians? And this is something, you know, you might think, why pedestrians? You know, why would this be impressive? And, you know, you think about, you know, object recognition. They're trying to get more and more complex scenarios. They're trying to do a better job at recognizing objects and, you know, and think about, you know, how can we push the field further? Well, pedestrians are good for many reasons. One is you can get a lot of data. It's something that might actually be practically useful. And pedestrians have this interesting characteristic that they're recognized by the silhouette. Everybody changes clothing. The main thing that makes a pedestrian is the boundary. It's like your legs and your side and, you know, the silhouette of your body. So this was like a new challenge because it was really hard to recognize objects at the time, which were recognized throughout by their silhouette. And this is something that Hogg or histogram of oriented gradients was the first to be able to show fairly reliably to work. Now, a lot of the questions that we asked so far were about, you know, specific instances, specific types of objects. But, you know, but then the field began to get more and more adventurous. And we started to look at, you know, can we recognize a large number of categories? You know, not just a single category or 4 categories, but can we recognize even more? And I put an asterisk on this because they wanted to recognize a large number of categories, but from a small number of examples. So from those of you who know Caltech 101 or 256, they had 101 or 256 different object categories, but the training examples, you had either 15 or you had 30. And that was the experimental setup, was, you know, 15 or 30 examples of 100 very different categories, and you had to then recognize, you know, more categories or more objects of that category. And it was a really difficult challenge, really tough to do it. Following in on that, we wanted to collect, you know, how do we do the same thing, not just for object classification, but also for detection. And this is where Pascal came about. And this really became, you know, during, you know, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, Pascal became the, you know, the main driver of object detection and just object recognition in general of the community, because it had a, you know, a large number of training examples. It's had several hundred, I think about 400 to maybe 1,000 training examples for each category. Had 20 different categories, which was a lot of categories. And it was well labeled, had the detection, had the bounding boxes around everything. So there was finally a data set that was large and had a lot of different categories. So we could finally ask the question, how do we detect objects of multiple classes? So if you think about it, let's say you're a graduate student up till this point, and you didn't have Pascal. Could you study object detection in multiple classes? Well, you'd have to go out, you'd have to collect a huge amount of data, right? Where do you get the data from? Well, the internet's still not quite what it is today, so it was really hard to get that data. If you go back to the Caltech 4, like that example with the faces and the motorcycles, you actually had to go and find those images yourself, which was really time consuming and hard. And if you spend the first 2 or 3 years of your PhD just trying to find data, you're not gonna have much time left to do research. So by having these data sets already created, it created the opportunity then for these graduate students to go out and actually try to build algorithms which could solve these problems. So then we could finally look at, you know, how do we detect objects in multiple classes? And this is something where the deformable parts model, you know, came to light. This is something that Ross Gershik, which I'm sure most all of you know, developed and worked on with his co-authors. And it was one of the first algorithms that worked pretty reliably on doing object detection and could work with deformable objects such as pedestrians and you know, bicycles here, and borrowed a lot of the ideas from Dellal and Triggs with their hog image descriptor. So as you can see, the community is beginning to build some momentum here, and they're getting more and more adventurous. So now the question rose is, how do we collect a really large number of training examples? So Fei Li, which probably everybody knows, was one of the main architects behind Caltech 101 and 256. And like I mentioned before, there's only 15 or 30 training examples per each one, which was still the largest data set of the time for this classification, this multi-way classification. But again, it wasn't that big. So Fei, I'm assuming, just said, how do we expand upon this? How do we do this even bigger? And the internet at that time was getting larger, and it was getting easier to collect images. And then the Google had been around and it started to work, so it was easier to collect a larger and larger number of images, and ImageNet came about. Now, so far I've been talking about computer vision, but at the same time, there's some really interesting advances happening in speech recognition. So there were several groups, probably about 4 different groups, who were looking at speech recognition, and they were looking at neural networks and applying it to speech recognition, and they were getting pretty good progress. If you go back and you read this paper, it's really interesting. It really gives a summary of the deep neural networks applied to speech recognition around 2012. And what you'll see is a lot of really kind of interesting observations. And they're noticing that the deep neural networks were outperforming the hand-tuned features really well on this task. And what this did is it gave people who were working on that a lot of confidence. They said, there's something here. There's something about neural networks that's special, that's working better than we expected. And one of those people, which everybody probably knows as well, is Jeff Hinton. And he said, this is really working. And that's kind of, that can act as an inspiration. And at the same time, one of Jeff's students was exploring a problem which probably, I'm not sure if hardly anybody at the time was even thinking about, which was, how do we train CNNs on a GPU? Nobody was really thinking about CNNs at the time, and pretty much nobody's thinking about GPUs at the time either. It was a very niche thing, like it's nothing like it was today. But he's sitting there and they're thinking about this, and he's trying to figure out, okay, how do we actually implement this? How do we do the details? How do we engineer, this? And then finally in 2011, Jeff asks a really interesting question, which is, how do I convince vision folks that DNNs work? How can I demonstrate that neural networks actually work for object recognition? And this was a really insightful question to ask, because this really opened up, like this was the right question to ask. So now, if you look at 2012, where were we? We were finally asking the right questions. So we had, how do you collect a really large number of training examples? You had ImageNet. How do we use DNNs for speech recognition, which basically inspired people and said, okay, it's working really well in this other domain. I bet you this could work really well in the computer vision domain as well. We know how to train CNNs with GPUs. We've had kind of some of the groundwork, CUDA's working, all that sort of things. And then finally, the final question is, how do we convince vision folks that DNNs work? How can we demonstrate this in a way that is really going to get the community to respect, or like to pay attention to this line of work? You put all those together and you get AlexNet, right? So finally, at that point in 2012, we took this inspirational question, which is, how can machines recognize objects familiar to humans? And we changed that question for being inspirational to one that was finally actionable. Obviously, AlexNet didn't solve object recognition or object detection. There's a lot of work that went on beyond that. A lot of things happened in the last 8 years. But at that point, the question finally felt like, hey, it works. It's actionable. We actually can figure out how to solve this problem. Okay, now let's look at all of this together. We have 1966, the first question that was asked, how can machines recognize objects familiar to humans? And then we have all the other questions that we went through throughout history until we could finally get to the final question. So it took us 45 years to finally ask the right questions. So let's look at these questions and just kind of bucket them into like different groups, to kind of get a sense for like how the community evolved through time. The first thing you'll notice is that some of these questions are what I think of as subset questions, which was, you take the primary question, which is, how do we recognize familiar objects that are familiar to humans? And then how do you break this into smaller questions where we don't want to recognize everything. We just want to recognize like a small thing, like a simple pattern or face, a corner, an edge, a digit, faces, pedestrians, that sort of thing. So these are kind of like breaking the problem into small problems. And this is what you do typically when you don't know how to answer the bigger question. You say, okay, how can I answer smaller questions around that? Another set of questions I think I'll categorize as too early. They asked interesting questions, but they're a little bit too early to ask them. The technology didn't exist or the data didn't exist at the time to really solve them in the right way. So for instance, in 1973, how do you detect faces? It was an interesting question to ask. There was like some interesting concepts put forward by these methods, but it was hard to really do it accurately and to do it well because we didn't have enough images and there wasn't enough compute power at the time to actually be able to do the problem effectively. It wasn't until early 2000 or late 1990s that we finally got face recognition to work well. In 2003, we tried to recognize categories. Same thing, like technology, we weren't using the right tools at the time. And we didn't have enough data to actually do how to recognize categories. Recognizing a large number of categories, CalCheck 101, 256, again, it was too hard to collect the data at that point. And then in 2008, when we had the deformable parts model, is how do we detect objects of multiple classes? It was just think about it. It was like just a little bit too early. I mean, it was like literally like 2 or 3 years too early before the deep neural network craze came about. And he just didn't have the right tools, at the time to really do it well. I mean, he did a great job. The deformable parts models are, awesome. And it's kind of like hand designing the first few layers of a neural network. But it was just a little bit before its time. The next set of questions are your practical questions, the things that need to be solved in order to solve your larger question, which is like, how do we actually capture a digital image? How do we collect a really large number of training examples? Those, and then, how do we train CNNs with GPUs? That one in 2009 is a really interesting one. How do we train CNNs on GPUs? Because if you look at it, and you're a graduate student, and you start thinking about, okay, I want to train a CNN, which is not popular. Everybody's using SVMs. Nobody believes in CNNs. And I want to do it on GPUs, and nobody's using GPUs. You really need to respect how far off in left field that was to work on it at that time. Like, to me, that's pretty amazing to have the guts to go and maybe the foresight to go and study that problem when it's so far out of the mainstream. Like that, and that, like set Alex up to be in the right place to then effectively be able to do AlexNet, 2 years later. You have outside questions, which are questions which are not posed by the computer vision community, but were posed by other communities, such as, can we use DNNs on speech recognition? So these are questions that, as a vision community, we're not thinking about, but other communities are, and they can act as inspiration. And it can help inform our decisions here. So this is something always to keep an eye out for, is to like look at other communities. And then finally, it's the evaluation question, which is, what is the right evaluation metric? And this was critical. Like, you can't underestimate this. It's like, you needed the right experimental setup to show that CNNs worked. Because when Jeff, okay, again, this is kind of, folklore at this point, but Jeff, went to Jitendra and asked, how can I convince computer vision people that CNNs work? And Jitendra's first response was obvious. He's like, Pascal, VOC, show it that it works on detection. And Jeff then looked at that data set, and I can't do it, not enough training examples. And then, Jitendra was like, oh, okay, well, I guess you could use ImageNet. Nobody's really looking at it right now, but it'd still be convincing. So why don't you try ImageNet? And then the rest is history. But if we didn't have ImageNet and, we only had, CalCheck 101 or 256, Jeff might still be looking. So, it's the fact that Jeff found the problem that he knew CNNs could be effective at, and he knew that would be convincing to the community, and not only to the vision community, but to like the larger, technology community as well. Like, that's a big deal. Like, identifying problems that if you solve them will be impactful is really, really important. All right. That's it for the history lesson. So how far are we? Let's go back to the common sense. So how far away are we from the common sense of a toddler? So what is common sense? In my opinion, it's the shared knowledge of a group. Here, the group is going to be toddlers, and it's basically the knowledge shared by toddlers. So how can we learn that knowledge? Well, toddlers know a lot of different things. Some are smarter than others. Some, are still learning whether grass is tasty or not, while others have learned a little bit better what to use grass for and what animals might like to feed grass. But we look at all the different things that toddlers can do, like manipulate objects, recognize objects, communicate with others, simple reasoning. These are all being researched right now, which is quite interesting, I think. They all are kind of subfields within the larger kind of AI community. And if you think about it, we're basically really heavily into the subset questions. We're trying to take this common sense question that we have, which is like this fairly high inspirational question, and we're breaking it into these smaller subparts. So if you look at it back on our trajectory, where are we right now? Well, I think the field's really close to where we were on object recognition, in the 80s, or 90s, where we're asking these kind of subset questions, like how do we break it into smaller and smaller problems so that way we can actually make progress. So one way to think about it is that we're right here, and we just have to wait another 20 years or so at this point to actually then to finally get to asking the right questions. But let's look at the other type of questions too. Let's look at like what things might be too early right now from studying common sense, which might be the practical questions you need to solve or outside of evaluation. So as far as too early, I think one of the ones that's really interesting is image captioning. This was a problem that was, put out there as like, oh, this is a great example of common sense because, if you can describe what's in an image, you need a lot of common sense to describe what's in that image. Unfortunately, this challenge is put out there. We created a data set of images and captions, and people showed really great results. But did it demonstrate common sense? And I think the clear answer is no, it didn't demonstrate common sense. And the reason for this was that the problem was actually surprisingly too easy. Is that there's so many images and there's so much bias in how people take images, is if you create a really large data set, there's already another image out there typically, which already which is pretty similar in content that you can basically borrow the caption from, and you'll get a good image caption. So through large data and statistical matching, it works without any real understanding of what's going on or what really is going on in that image. VQA, and just as an aside here, all the ones I'm being negative on, I'm just being negative on my work that I'm involved in, so that way I don't get anybody upset. So I'll try to pick on myself on these as best as possible. VQA, this is actually, VQA came out of a reaction to the image captioning being too hard to evaluate. So the question was, okay, with VQA, it's still an image and language task, but it's easier to evaluate because there's a fixed number of answers. And one of the hopes was that you would need common sense reasoning to answer the questions. And the one here in the middle, I think is really interesting, which was, does this person have 20/20 vision? So in order to ask that question, you have to understand that 20/20 vision means that that you have good eyesight, which means that you don't need glasses, which means, does this person have glasses or not? And that's a really, that required a lot of common sense reasoning, but unfortunately the dataset doesn't have too many questions in it that are of that ilk. Plus, there's no way from just training on the data set to answer these questions. There's not enough common sense knowledge built into the data set itself. I would love to answer questions about an image like this. I mean, you think about the amount of common sense that you need to answer a question about this image here. This is what I aspire to, but it's not where we are right now as far as a community. Practical questions, like how do we interact with the world at large? I think we had a lot of great talks today about strapping cameras on babies' foreheads or other people's foreheads to learn about the world at large. But how do we actually, can we do that with robots? There's a lot of work out there on simulations like Habitat. There's a ton of other research, like other groups that are doing research in this space as well, creating simulated environments. How do we actually interact with humans? This is really tough. Humans are expensive. Humans, it's hard to get a lot of a human's time. We're not going to be able to get somebody to raise a robot for us and to spend 3 years doing it, or at least not a lot of them without paying a lot of money. So it's really hard to think of scenarios where we can interact with humans, at mass. And it was one of the motivations behind Craft Assist, which is an environment that we're building for Minecraft, in which people can interact with other humans within Minecraft and hopefully learn from that experience. And then, I think a lot of common sense is actually about being embedded in the environment, which means that you need to have a physical presence in there. So, building reliable, safe, engaging robots is a big challenge. Outside questions. So how do you build better batteries? like this is something that we don't think of, but it's probably one of the biggest things holding us back in solving this common sense question. Is like, if you need something that's out there in the real world, we need something that can run on really long, for 24 hours straight or 8 hours straight. So we need to build better batteries. Um, how can you build a successful mass consumer robot? This kind of like, how do you get people to upload all of their images to the internet? That's how ImageNet happened. That's how image classification worked. We might not be able to solve the common sense question until there are robots out in the world and we all own these robots and we finally allow them to be open, like to share the data so we can actually train these robots effectively. And how does the brain, and then it could come from like other fields, like, how does the brain quickly incorporate new information or insights from child development? Like a lot of things that we heard already today. Evaluation. How do we measure common sense knowledge? And this is something I have not heard, like, I don't think any of us know how to measure common sense knowledge, especially of a toddler. Like, does a machine have the same common sense knowledge of a toddler? It's hard to tell. How do we convince people that this is the case? This is really the question that keeps me up at night. This is the one that's really hard, I think, of all of them. Something like clever. This is something that, we finally wanted to shine a spotlight on reasoning and visual question answering and reasoning. We put a lot of time into this data set and we made very careful evaluation metrics for it. We put it out there and within 3 months it was, solved. The accuracy was 98% or something like that. And this to me got worrying because like it's, as soon as you put a number on something, suddenly it's easy. Once you clearly define something, it's like more clearly defined it is, the easier the problem is to solve. So it's really this kind of gotcha type of thing. Evaluation, the streetlight effect. This is huge, I think, rampant right now in the community, which is, if you read this thing, I'm looking for my quarter, for my quarter I dropped, the police officer says, did you drop it here? And the guy says, no, I dropped it 2 blocks down the street. The guy says, why are you looking for it here? And the man says, because the light is better here. This is what's happening all over the computer vision field right now is, what is the experimental setup for the different approaches that we have? And a lot of them, big data, is big. You have tons of compute, those sort of things, a lot of human labels, supervised, that sort of thing. Coco is a big example of this. Why didn't we stay with Pascal? Why did we need Coco? Well, let's bring Pascal into the deep learning era by having more training examples. That was Coco. We're basically adjusting to the hammer that we needed to use to show better results. Things like hair dryers. We wanted to have hair dryers in the data set. We don't. Why? Because it's really hard to get images of hair dryers, of people using hair dryers in the real world, because people don't take pictures of themselves drying their hair for obvious reasons. So we had to drop that category from the data set. That's a bias, like this is something that, we need to recognize these biases in our data sets. Evaluating with humans. This is something that we struggle with a lot too, because in order to, have a common sense knowledge, you need to interact with humans, but how do you, and then humans need to evaluate it. How do you do that? There's a lot of problems with the Turing test, et cetera. Even for simple things like image captioning, evaluating with humans is super important. We recently did some work on reconstructing MRI images. And it was amazing how even in that, which you think can be done with like machines to evaluate it, was not effective. You actually needed to have humans in the loop looking at these images to say whether the knee on the left was just as good as the knee on the right in doing image reconstructions. And then, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And that's something that I think as a community, we're going to forever struggle with. It's hard to publish a paper if you can't give a number. And that's something else that I think we need to, I'm not sure what to do about that, to be honest with you, but I think it's something that, it's really challenging. Like how do we publish a paper on something that is hard to quantify? But all this being said, we need to keep moving forward. Be creative, think of new tasks. You never know if you're going to hit it. What's going to be around the next corner. And then I got just a few minutes left. As a final note, I just want to, raise, since I've been asking this whole time about questions, and we've been talking about questions this whole time, I think it's worthwhile just raising, be careful about the questions you ask and the research that you raise. I bet you many of you have seen in the news over the last few weeks, the use of facial recognition. Companies are no longer like allowing facial recognition to be used by police, et cetera. We need to think about what the impact is of our research more now than ever, because it works. there's real practical impact of the work that we're doing. So we should be careful about, are we asking the right questions? And then, what impact is that going to have in the long term? Because as our research ideas grow up and they leave home, we no longer control them. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Any questions? Aaron Sloman was raising hand.
Okay, Aaron, you're allowed to talk.
Okay, well, I think it's important, but it's quite a short question. Some of the early work on vision in the late 1960s and early 70s by Max Clues and the other one I've forgotten, Huff, was concerned with identifying pictures of impossible objects. And that depended on the computer having a generative notion for a class of 3D structures and the images that could be projected from those 3D structures, and was able to reason that certain images could not come from any object in that class. Now, none of that kind of impossibility seems to be in the work based on neural nets and statistical reasoning. And in fact, by statistics, you cannot ever derive an impossibility anyway. So I wonder whether our speaker, whose talk was really wonderful, has any thoughts about that.
It's funny, I was actually discussing that problem with somebody earlier today, and specifically in reference to GANs, because one of the things you'll notice if you look closely at GANs and you look at the results that they generate is for very structured objects, think dogs or, horses or something like that, is they'll kind of generate parts of horses, right? But like the horse will have like 2 legs, or it might have 6 legs, or, it'll have like these weird kind of body configurations that a human would never make. So I think that is that's something that our models aren't doing right now, and they're not understanding the underlying concepts. That being said, one thing that I think is really interesting is if you go around and you ask a room of 20 people, draw me a picture of a bicycle. I guarantee you probably 2 people will draw that bike correctly. Like all of them will draw the bikes and they'll have the bike frame in some weird position, and almost all of them will be non-functioning bikes. So, I would challenge you right now to actually sit down on a piece of paper and try to draw a bike. Unless you're like a bike enthusiast, I think you have a hard time drawing it, even though we probably all see bicycles almost every single day of our lives. So I don't think it's a prerequisite for making a lot of this common sense reasoning to work, is to be able to do that, to say whether something's feasible or not necessarily.
Well, we could go on talking, but I guess other people are wanting to ask questions.
So, I guess maybe due to time constraint, we just ask one more question. I think another raising hand is from Ajay Divakaran.
Yeah, I wanted to know about compositionality. I mean, the consistent theme I'm getting is that toddlers are able to look at one thing and then they're able to compound things and derive, right? They synthesize a lot of stuff. Isn't that element kind of missing in the whole deep learning way of doing things?
So I think the right way to think about that is it's not only missing in the deep learning models, but I don't think that's really a fault of the deep learning community necessarily, but it's a problem with our data sets. And the problem with our evaluation metrics is most of our data sets actually fully, like the training and testing data sets are sampled from the same distribution. So that way you don't have to deal with compositionality. And what we need is a better, and this isn't for all, there's obviously data sets out there, even Clever, like there's a variant of that has this, and there's many other data sets out there as well that have this, but it's not in the not as much in the mainstream. But we need more data sets where the train and test are distinct from each other, where the only way to do well on test is to be able to to be able to generalize, to transfer, to compositionally rearrange things in order to solve the problem. And that's something where some of the models with the attention mechanisms and whatnot are going in that direction. They're getting better at it. But I think we need to improve or have more focus on that when we think about data sets and evaluation metrics, for the community.
Thank you.